Psychoanalysis, Part 2, Veterinary Psychotherapy. Namaste. So far, with our subject expert, Dr. Himanshu Vaidya, we have discussed in Part 1 about the species other than humans. Is there a need of understanding their psyche? Is there a need for them to undergo some kind of therapy? Is it even possible as a concept? Welcome back, sir. We had a very interesting discussion so far. In this part two, we were in the discussion where we arrived at a point that in any kind of a therapy, there's a lot of weightage given to the history taking, where there is a language barrier in case of animals. Guide us through how it is possible there.
Difficulty is acute on this point. The animal can't give his case history, nor can any informant of his species give. So the informant who can give us is the human being. And the human being, to the best of his capabilities, whatever he can observe and whatever he can articulate, because many of the things are very subtle. They happen non-verbally inside of us. So it would take somebody very perceptive, somebody very trained, so to say, or talented or gifted to really give a good case history of his pet. And maybe we have to train people into this, how to be with an animal so as to collect information for a case history. But the bare facts can always be given. When was the pet born? What were the attacks on the pet? What is his normal food intake? When did the difficulty start? And so on and so forth. So bare facts can always be given by somebody. The deeper facts of feelings, of thoughts, they would need a training, and some of it can be given, some of it cannot be given. Now, we are discounting here the esoteric fact of artificial intelligence converting their language into our language. So, this is the difficulty about the animal. It's almost like finding an abandoned child. That if a child is abandoned on the streets and the child is in a pre-linguistic stage of his life, say 1 year of age, 1.5 years of age, who is going to give you the case history? And yet, you see the trauma and you also treat the trauma. What you know only are the bare facts. That the child was abandoned and he seems to have been well taken care of at least 10 to 15 days before the abandonment took place, or maybe even 3 days before the abandonment took place. So, just as you would go about in a heuristic way, treating an abandoned child who is not having a flourishing language capability, similarly, you would have to go here. And as we said before, the non-verbal part of therapy, the play therapy format, the silent working of the therapist, those are the tools which would be of use. And what would be important is not only the case history of the past when we find it, but the case history as it builds up over a period of time as he lives it. Because case history is not something static. If you take case history today and if you take case history 5 years later, there would be events of 5 years which would add to the case history. Case history is a dynamic thing. So what would happen is the here and now would become very important. Just as in therapy, one of the approaches is to use here and now. Some therapists use it. They don't go so much in the case history, but they focus in here and now. That what is happening in the therapy room. So the case history is taken only as a reference point. But the prime focus is on here and now. So the same thing would apply here. We would be focusing on here and now and allow the case history to build up as we are working in here and now. And of course, make a note of it. So this would ultimately lead to specialization in different species. Because the species are so different that it's difficult for somebody to be an expert in all mammals, leave alone all animals. So I think over a period of time, it will get into, because anybody who does this kind of thing will need a deep zoological study of that species.
True, the behavioral aspect, where the behavioral psychology would be also an implementation.
So that zoological aspect of those species, that needs to be studied. One has to really have some deep information about the species that one is trying to dabble into psychotherapy with.
While there has been so many experiments with the domesticated species where we have been lab creating the new species and crossbreeding, there is more complicated aspect to it.
Correct. And with genetic engineering, it will be a completely different scene. The whole canvas will be a different canvas than the kind of static canvas we are envisioning right now.
Like I have myself mastered so many pets, and I have seen the species, particularly who are hybrid species, who are interspecies, as in the same what do you call it? The breed is different in dogs, especially the temperament, everything is altered, and they know how they have created that temperament would be. There was one of the dogs. The temperament would be of a bulldog, but his size and shape was that of a Chihuahua. And he was very aggressive and ferocious dog, but nobody could believe because he was so tiny. So that kind of behavioral selection has been done in genetics. So it would be really difficult to navigate what is the actual response of the species.
So the species would have to be studied, and one would have to focus and almost become a specialist in a few species for this kind of practice to happen.
More in depth. Right now, we are just aware of the behavioral aspects of the species.
Correct.
Especially the domesticated ones.
That's true. And with respect to the carnivorous species, it will be even more difficult. Because the therapy there has to be from a distance. And the therapist himself would need therapist if anything goes wrong. So it's a very difficult situation.
Maybe a plastic surgeon or an ortho.
Yeah. So that kind of a safe distance therapy.
Right.
That's a very different cup of tea within the veterinary domain. And we are not even talking about the birds or aquatic animals, which are completely different. We are still in the rudimentary nascent phase, and the max we can talk about, I think, is the mammals.
So even with pets like dolphins, who are very close to humans, who have been kind of domesticated, there has been a better understanding of their species. And I think it is to do with those which have a certain amount of intellectual capacity are the only animals which can be domesticated.
One interesting point that comes out of this, something very interesting. That has to do with, I was to come to it a bit later, but since the point has come up, there is a very strong research and discussion on the linkage of intelligence with the brain. And there is this very interesting area coming up of a non-brain or a brainless intelligence. That intelligence need not be confused with a brain. There would be species where the intelligence centers, so to say, are spread out throughout the body. And the neurons, they have conglomerations at many points rather than one central server. It's like there are many small servers instead of one big server.
It's not the CNS for them.
Yeah. So it's a decentralized data center system.
Even a similar study has been done for the plants and trees also, that though their system is very different from ours, but they do have these kind of systems where they process the emotions of each other.
Correct. So intelligence does not have to be brain dependent.
It's not a structural organ driven concept.
The same function can happen in a variety of ways. The brain is not indispensable for it. And that brings about a completely different idea in veterinary psychotherapy. That how in situations where intelligence is not brain dependent, how do we see the psyche operating? And that will require a very different study and a very different approach. People talk about, even about the octopus, about the same thing, that they are very high in intelligence.
Right.
So I have heard in some country, I don't remember the exactly, maybe UK, but I'm not very sure. Some country has given the octopus the status of a legal person, which would mean killing an octopus would constitute some sort of a crime.
Oh my God. Even for crows.
Right.
So we have seen we humans consider ourselves as the supreme species on the name of intellect and the development we have made. But unfortunately or sadistically, we use all the animals in lab testing environment to
Right.
see how the DNA responds to certain medication, treatments, cosmetics, and blah, blah, and even studies. So coming to the stream related to psychology, the psychedelics, can psychedelics be tested out here?
I think they already must be doing it. But on a standalone basis, the answer is yes. That can psychedelics be used for can psychedelics be used for veterinary psychotherapy? I think it's worth exploring, just as it's worth exploring in human beings. And obviously, one of the safe things to do would be to first use it in animal psychotherapy and then bring it to human beings. And I'm sure it would be a part of some clinical research protocol somewhere. It would be interesting to see if somebody has created effective psychiatric drugs for veterinary purposes. I'm not knowledgeable about it, but it would be interesting to see and on what basis they go about. And if one studies that, then very near to that would be trying out psychedelics for psychiatric purposes in the veterinary area. I'm sure there would be a specialty of that type. I'm not knowledgeable, but there would be something of that. Bottom line is, if it can help them and then it can help us, then why keep it out of the study of the pain? So it's worth experimenting, of course, safely as we can, of psychedelics, not only psychedelics, but some traditional herbal substances also, like the type of herbal substances that shamans use in traditional psychiatric healing. So under the protocol of a scientific system with some safety and humanism built in, it would be worthwhile to experiment out psychedelics, herbal substances, some non-conventional ways of healing.
In Tantra and many of the mythological stories, there has been some mention of animals being giving such concoctions where they would behave and, get possessed kind of a thing. And then, so that means the concept has been there in fantasy and definitely it must have been put on trial as well.
Yeah, I think so.
As you just mentioned somewhere in the discussion that intelligence is not an organ structure driven thing. It can be with a more advanced or lesser advanced version of some kind of circulatory system, rather, I would say. So when we talk about intelligence or brain driven or not so driven with brain, there is problem solving, there is creativity, there is intelligence, there is cognition.
Correct.
So is a day conceivable where you have CBT and psychoanalysis type veterinary therapies?
It will evolve to that eventually. So the way one can look at specializations evolving there are, it will be one definitely species based to start with, and then we can have more approach based, whether you are thought centered or emotion centered or behavior centered. And what we see in human beings, I think broadly the same kind of distribution would be there, except that we would look at more behavior driven. That is what we are better at. Because the other things are difficult to really do. You actually have to find a roundabout way to communicate something or make somebody feel something. because a direct way of language is not available. So for every small thing, a roundabout, indirect way has to be found. So it's almost like creating a package of tools for every small thing. And therefore, what one can conceive at this moment is, although we have a long way to go, and there's long time before people even start taking interest in this, we are finding it difficult even to do it for human beings, leave apart other animals. So it may be somewhere in distant future, but whenever that time comes, once it comes, it will get into a gradual evolution of this area. First, people will attempt more on the species lines, and then it will be more approach based. And initially, it will be, when it's approach based, initially it will be behaviorally heavy, unless, as we said, artificial intelligence decodes something in terms of language. That will change the scene completely. If it does, then of course, everything that you do in the human sphere can be transplanted in some way to the animals. But short of it, it will be behavior heavy. And it will involve some tools, both of holistic healing as well as tools of classical psychotherapy, which may be play therapy tools, which may be psychodrama tools, but some tools which will be there.
Somewhere, I don't know why, while you were explaining this, I came in touch with the psychoanalytic part of understanding of unconscious, because according to Freudian basis, there is more of instincts which we can, categorically see more in the animals. They are morely instinct driven.
Right.
And similarly, just like humans, if we apply those instincts which he has mentioned, because we see even in pets, they have this, survival instinct, and then there is a competitive instinct, then there is this having best mate, which is the Oedipus for them. So somewhere psychoanalysis falls very close to the instinct-driven mind of animals, and future seems to be little bright there.
Yeah, I mean, future is bright both ways. We don't have to say, okay, we could not work in human beings, so we ran away to animals. But we work equally well both sides. In fact, what psychoanalysis talks about, the non-rational part of the mind and the strange paradoxes which coexist, which we find it astounding in other areas given the rational basis. But psychoanalysis is at comfort with this very difficult, almost impossible kind of paradoxes which coexist. And that we see even in animals. On one hand, the will to survive is very strong. On the other hand, the survival of the self is often surrendered to the survival of the species. You can see many of the animal mothers sacrificing themselves to save the cub. So the survival of the species overtakes the survival of the self. The attachment overtakes the survival of the self. At the same time, the third paradox would be, if you see somebody losing one or two children in rapid succession, you can see them going so depressed that even if their predator is next to them, they don't move. They don't care if the predator eats them. They are just too depressed to save themselves to live. There's such resignation, such despondency, such gloom, such sadness, such all-consuming inner black hole of gloom. Okay, they don't even try to save themselves from predators.
True.
So you can see that deep acute depression, overcoming them for certain times, and then again once they're out of it, and often they're out of it when they get something that they like very much, which is the substance they're addicted to. For cats, it's like the milk.
Yes.
So it gets them out of that depressive phase.
As mammals also go through the good breast and the bad breast, not to miss.
Right, right. So we see this paradoxes also. So I'm sure all that is there in us is in some protoform in them. What is there in us has not fallen from heaven all of a sudden. It has evolved through them. So we find everything, all the paradoxes, all the contradictions all the complexities in us in a prototype in them. And therefore, what applies to us should in some form apply to them, which includes psychoanalysis.
So when we're talking about their mind and their psyche, for humans, we always consider a more holistic approach towards it for an overall well-being. Does holistic healing have anything to offer our juniors?
Juniors respond very well to homeopathy. In fact, homeopathy was accused of being a placebo.
Oh.
Right, as a pathy, because there is a existential survival battle. It's a battle of annihilation almost between homeopathy and allopathy.
Oh.
It should not be, but that is what the pharma companies have made it to be. So pharma companies unleashed their corporate campaigns. And if you go to Wikipedia, you will see a write-up on homeopathy which calls it almost a placebo.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Wikipedia should be taken to court for it. So one of the things which homeopathy did to overcome these charges of placebo was to develop homeopathic medication for animals and agricultural situations.
Okay.
You can't have a placebo there. Right? You can't have placebo in a wheat plant or a maize plant or a mango tree. And you cannot have it in cows and buffaloes and oxes. So veterinary homeopathy as well as agro-homeopathy have become very popular. And they have shown very good results. So one important component of holistic healing will be this homeopathy component, that they respond very well to the homeopathic medications. The second is herbal substances. The third would be, I suspect, would be acupressure. Now, how to do it is a different thing altogether. We may have to introduce machines to do it. We may not be able to touch them. It would be too dangerous. So we would need machines to give it from a distance. But
usually animals are very cooperative because they understand who's helping them and who's harming them.
Correct. Correct. That is true. But there are some who are slightly on the aggressive side.
Okay.
So for them, it's better to maintain a safe distance of this kind of a thing. Because when the acupressure actually presses, it would create a pulse of pain. So that is one part. Psychedelics, as we said, another part. And the herbal substances, and many of them, they know it themselves. Like which herbal substance to take in which sickness, they instinctively know it. So instead, on this component of herbal lotions, we would be learning more from them and they less from us. Because in the forest situation, they instinctively know which plant to ingest for which medicine, for which trouble.
True.
So in fact, some people do it that when an animal is suffering from some problem, if the problem is clearly noted down, you just set the animal free and he finds his medicine. And that in turn becomes a discovery for human beings.
True.
So it's like an animal-assisted pharmacological research. So I think apart from this, there would be a necessity to develop a basket full of tools for play therapy kind of situations or distant therapy kind of situations for catharsis. And tools brings me to the point that in general, we are a tool deficient discipline when it comes to psychotherapy or psychoanalysis in particular. And holistic healing that way is slightly better. They are slightly better in tool development, but that also is not satisfactory. I think we need more of that tool development for holistic healing, both for the human situation and for the veterinary situation.
Strange subject to say the least. It opened up a fresh area I never thought of before, at least for me. Hope you liked it. See you all again. Namaste.
Namaste.